Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Ledford. It is a delight to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Jennifer Ledford is an associate professor in the Department of Special Education in the Early Childhood Special Education and Applied Behavior Analysis programs. Dr. Ledford has expertise in single case research design, response prompting procedures, and classroom-based peer-mediated instruction. Her current research relates to improving use and synthesis of research in special education, treating food selectivity and increasing imitation for children with autism, and improving the use of evidence-informed practices by practitioners. She was recently awarded the Division for Early Childhood of the Council for Exceptional Children's Award for Mentoring. Congratulations on that. That's awesome. Was that at the January virtual conference that we just had?
No, it was the one before that.
The one before. Congratulations. That's awesome. Dr. Ledford is the author of more than 50 peer-reviewed articles and 2 textbooks related to single case design and instruction for young children. And I'm using this one in my class right now. I love it. Dr. Ledford, how did you get started with applied behavior analysis?
Well, when I was completing my undergraduate degree in psychology, I found a social skills group run by clinical psychologists that included children with autism. And I just had this sort of immediate kinship with them. And I just found it very interesting to think about things like, how do we teach children who don't easily learn social skills that I like your shirt is a fine compliment, but I like your nose is completely out of bounds, right? And so we have all of these strange social rules that we typically don't have to tell people about. And so it was just really interesting to me to figure out what those rules were and how to teach them to children who didn't learn them sort of throughout their like daily typical lives. So I decided to get my master's degree at the University of Georgia with David Gast, who was a behaviorist before the BACB existed. So, and he taught me so much about teaching and learning and sort of how you can break it down and explain how 2-year-olds learn language and 4-year-olds learn social skills and graduate students learn complex single case designs. And then I got my doctorate at Vanderbilt with Mark Woolery, who was also a behaviorist and one of the smartest people I've ever known. So I just sort of fell into being a mentee with these 2 old great names in behavior analysis who also happen to be wonderful mentors. So sort of my whole career from undergraduate on has really been sort of filled with great behaviorists that I learned a lot from.
Wow, that's amazing. And you're passing it forward and taking the gifts that you got from Dr. Gast and Dr. Woolery, who are huge pioneers in our field, and passing it forward and your recognition with Division for Early Childhood for mentorship too. I think it's really neat how you took what you received and are giving it to the next generation. Well, and you mentioned Dr. Gast, and he's one of the co-authors of your textbook. If you were to write a headline for applied behavior analysis and you were going to pick the most important story, what would the headline be?
Yeah, I think this changes year by year. You know, if you'd asked me last year, I might have said something different. And, 10 years ago, certainly it would be different. But recently, I've been really interested in exploring misconceptions around applied behavior analysis. So the headline would probably be something like, ABA isn't what you think it is. People just assume that ABA therapists sort of sit at a table with kids with autism all day long and sort of do compliance trials. And I think that's sort of a really old school misconception that's really hard to get past. And our field is so much more diverse than that. And I think that's an important story to tell sort of the general public, as well as people who might use our services.
That's great. And you're at Vanderbilt. And my mentor, Dr. Diane Bricker, she started her career there. Well, it was one of the places that she was at in her early career and also as a student. And she I remember her telling me stories about the Susan Gray School and how she would do trials and experiments with children. And it was so interesting. It seems like there's so many exciting things that are happening at Vanderbilt then and now. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I actually still work with children at the Susan Gray School really regularly. The pandemic has changed some of that, so we can't do quite as much in the classroom with lots of kids. I'm hoping that we're sort of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and we can get back to that soon. But certainly since I was a doc student, my research has occurred, much of my research has occurred in the Susan Gray School. And I think we've probably gotten a little bit more naturalistic over time, right? So we try not to like pull kids out into a room unless there's a really good reason to do that. But yeah, I think that it's really interesting to sort of stand on the steps that, you know, people like Diane Bricker, and there are so many important people who've worked at that school, and to think that the things that I know now are really the result of what they started. So that's really exciting.
That is, yes, definitely. Do you want to talk a little bit about research design? And I mean, you're the author of textbooks about this topic, and I just would love to hear your ideas. When we design research, it's kind of similar to how artists do it in a way. There's all these different ways to communicate with art and with design, and with research, we start with a question, and where we go with that question is so much about design and knowing different types of design. And your expertise, one of them is single case design. Do you want to talk a little bit about where your interest in that field has come from?
Sure. Well, I mentioned that I had great mentors, and David Gast had a previous book, Tawny and Gast, and I believe the publication date on that was 1986. So I was 5 when that one was. But you know, about 25 years later, he really saw the need for an updated version. And I had just been in the master's program, so he asked me to work on a few of the chapters. And I just really nerded out about the research once I sort of got deep into it. And I think he saw the nerd sparkle in my eye. And so he asked if I would co-author the 2014 version, and then asked if I would take the lead author in 2018. So I think partially it was just that I was at the right place at the right time, and partially it's because I just really got into the weeds and couldn't get out. You know, I really liked being in there. And so it's been so much work, but it's been really interesting to be able to think really deeply about the methods that we use, and to sort of figure things out, from like graphing conventions to IOA to different measurement systems. And it's been really helpful for me to say, like, do we really know if that's true or not? That's in this 2010 version, but I don't know if there's any research. And then, you know, 2 hours later, I've like found 20 articles about this thing. So that's been really fun. And more recently, it's been really fun to interact with single case researchers on Twitter, and to learn more about single case meta-analysis. And I think the single case methods community it's like a real nerd fest, which I love so much. And I really appreciate the opportunities that community has given me to really keep learning. And there's so much to learn. And when you first think about single case design and you sort of see a graph, you think like, oh, this makes sense and it's really simple. And in some ways it is simple, but it can get so complex. And if you don't quite have the right methods, then your ability to answer your question is really impaired. So even if you don't want to be a methodologist, I think it's really helpful to understand the designs really deeply, so that you can really understand how to best answer the substantive questions that you care about.
Yes, definitely. And you and I both work with young children, and early childhood special education is preschoolers, early intervention is infants and toddlers. And one of the uh, things that I love about single case design is it's so wonderful for children with exceptionalities. When you want to capture something on an individual basis, and then you have that visual summary that you can use to communicate what happened. And that can uh, be used with parents and families, because they can see the visual summary and it's not this wall of text like in a report or a bunch of numbers and statistics or standard deviations, but it's a line graph, or it's some type of visual summary that's going to help bridge that communication gap. And then also with people where maybe English is not their first language, or we're communicating across languages, it's is such a powerful tool that way.
Absolutely. I think that the sensitivity, right, is so important, because oftentimes parents of children get sort of really broad omnibus pictures of where their children are developmentally. And sometimes I think that can feel really overwhelming. But if you can use these single case designs and things like showing them graphs of the progress that's being made, I think is really, really helpful to parents, teachers, paraprofessionals. Line graphs are sort of pretty easily understood, certainly more so than standard scores that are comparing them to other children. So yeah, I think the applicability of single case, even if teachers don't use like rigorous single case design with fidelity and IOA and all the things that we sort of do for research purposes, if they understand single case concepts, I think it really helps them understand how to evaluate their teaching and whether it's working or not, and to communicate with others about how it's working.
Yeah. What are some pitfalls or barriers for single case?
Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about it. I think part of the problem is that it's sort of deceptively complex, right? So I think new investigators and people for whom single case isn't their primary methodology, they think like, oh, I can do this simple little single case study. But really, most single case studies take a long time and involve a lot of resources. So I think that it sort of seems simpler than it is, which is a little bit of a problem sometimes. But I think there are so many benefits, right? That we can overcome that problem without any problem. So we talked about the sensitivity to behavior change. I think the dynamic nature of single case design is a really good fit for practitioners, because if an intervention happens to not work, or it doesn't work as well as you want it to, you can modify it so that it does work for every individual. And so I think that the sort of usability of single case design is a real benefit that doesn't quite apply to some of the other methodologies that we use.
Yeah. I was just working with a group on creating multiple baseline graphs across participants. And I was looking at each child's data. And the nice thing about single case is the children so well, and what happened in baseline, what happened during the intervention. Every single one of those data points is a memory. It's like, oh my gosh, I remember that day, session 12. That was an aha moment. Or, oh, that child didn't have their breakfast that morning, and that data point really reflected that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is kind of wonderful from a research standpoint, right? We don't just like come in and assess a kid, and we really get to know the kids who we serve. And I think that feels good as a researcher, right? I didn't get into the field to nerd out about single case. It's a benefit and I love it. Got into the field to help young children, right? Sort of be their best selves. And so I think single case design certainly allows you to see the growth for individual children, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, definitely. So B.F. Skinner is one of the godfathers, or a parent in our field. What does his work mean to you?
As a single case methodologist, I really appreciate his work understanding rate of responding and their relation to different reinforcement schedules. That really set the stage for how to understand individuals' behaviors across different conditions. And that's sort of the cornerstone of single case design. So I really appreciate that early work, sort of setting the stage for the more complex designs that we use now. And I think anyone who has taught a minimally verbal child to engage in increasingly complex social interactions has to appreciate Skinner's work related to verbal behavior, because it really helped us organize interventions to help children communicate what they want to communicate with us. And I think that's really important.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I think a lot of people associate him with radical behaviorism, but he's done so many more things that I think it's surprising to read other things that he's written and articles and books. One that I love is an article that he wrote probably in 1986, in the 1980s sometime, and it's called Thinking Aid. And it talks about tools for writing and how to set up writing process, but strategies for yourself. And I use that when I teach some students writing, because it's so powerful. I mean, you don't even have to be in this field to read that article and learn how to become a better writer from the way he sets up that manuscript. And I was just wondering if you had any favorites of his that
it's so crazy, because so much of the work that he did, it underlies everything that we do today, right? It's fun to think about, like, where would we be if Skinner hadn't existed, right?
Yeah.
It's just that he transformed how we think about how individuals respond based on their environment. And I think that that's such a powerful idea. And he sort of had his hands in all kinds of things, right? And so I think sort of everywhere you look in the field of applied behavior analysis, some part of it is related to work that Skinner did. So it's almost like hard to pick just one. So I think that it's interesting, because I almost don't even have another paradigm, right? So I had an undergrad in psychology, so I was exposed to other paradigms, but since my master's program, it's sort of been all behaviorism all the time. And I just like almost can't think in any other way, right? And I really think that the root of effective instruction, right? Skinner just sort of helped us figure out, how is it that we teach, and how is it that individuals learn. And so he sort of set the stage for us to realize that not learning isn't an individual's problem, it's their teacher's problem, right? And I think that's really powerful. And I think that we sometimes in research say things like response to intervention, and I don't really love that term, because it sort of makes it sound like a problem with the individual. They didn't respond to the intervention, rather than a problem with the intervention, which is that the intervention wasn't working for that child. So I think the sort of setup around how individuals, animals, humans respond to their environment adaptively is just the cornerstone of everything I do now.
That's great. Thank you. Do you want to talk a little bit about the research that you're doing right now, like with the food selectivity and the response interruption and redirection? And I mean, you are just on fire doing so many cool things.
Yeah, I'll talk about two things that we're doing now. One is related to imitation. And so we sort of took a hiatus from working with children for the past year because of the pandemic, but we're finally back into it. And I'm really excited because I've done several studies that help children, mostly children with autism, but also children with other delays, learn how to imitate And I became really interested in the context in which we expect children to imitate. So most programs that teach children to imitate rely on a mass trial context to teach them to imitate, and I have done that myself. But also, we really want children to be able to imitate in typical context, right? Not just when we tell them to. It's important for them to learn to do it when we tell them to, because it's very helpful for instruction, right? If a child can't imitate, then you might have to use physical prompts, and those aren't bad, but they're more restrictive. You can't do them with multiple children at once. So children who can imitate can learn more readily. That's super important. But also, children imitate their caregivers. So very early on in infancy, children and caregiver imitation is a way that caregivers and children communicate with each other, right? And then toddlers imitate each other during play. And so I became really interested in how we teach kids to imitate and how that matches with what we want kids to do in their typical environment. So I think that there are sort of two major contexts. Kids need to imitate during instruction because it makes their ability to access learning more sort of broad. And they really also need to be able to imitate during play. And that's mostly for social reasons, right? So I did this review and I found actually that teaching embedded during play activities actually resulted in better outcomes than teaching in mass trials. But I think the more interesting thing is that we don't have any evidence that teaching in instructional contexts helps in play context, and that teaching in play context helps in instruction context. And I really think we need kids to do both, but no one's teaching in both ways. So we're doing a study right now where we're teaching kids to imitate an adult during play, a child during a classroom activity like art or Play-Doh, and an adult during mass trial instruction. And so far, children are learning in the context that we're teaching them, but they're not generalizing to the other types. And I think that that tells us as a field, we really need to think about when do we expect kids to use these skills and to teach them across contexts. So I think that's really interesting because in sort of ABA practice, what I've mostly seen is mass trial, but we have some evidence that that's not going to generalize to play. And then there's lots of work in the naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions in DBI world where we teach kids to imitate during play, but we don't have evidence that they're going to use that during instruction. So I think that we're sort of like going in with blinders on and improving kids' behavior, but not really thinking about how to help kids generalize that. So I'm really interested in doing that right now. And we're also working on a review of RIRD, response interruption and redirection. So basically when a child's engaging in a behavior, usually stereotypy, you interrupt it and you redirect it to another behavior. So you like have a kid engage in a series of verbal tasks or motor imitation. So if a kid's engaging in stereotypy, you might say, like, hey, do this, do this. So you interrupt it and then you redirect it to something else. So it seems sort of innocuous, but it is a punishment-based procedure. So we really wanted to think about the ethics of using RIRD for something that's mostly not harmful, right? So vocal stereotypy might be distracting, but it's not physically harmful generally. It has been used for SIB some. But we really wanted to know whether authors sort of attended to the ethical code when they were using RIRD. And we're still analyzing our data, but we definitely have some recommendations for researchers and practitioners around the use of RIRD because we don't have any good data that suggests that using RIRD results in long-term generalized reductions, right? So it's punishment-based. It probably doesn't maintain or generalize. So we in general think practitioners should avoid it. And when you need to use it, we think that the redirection component really needs to include teaching functional skills, right? So if you're going to redirect a child's motor stereotypy during play, what you really need to do is teach them how to play so that they have a replacement behavior rather than asking them to do sort of arbitrary tasks that they already can do. So we really think the sort of purpose should be about teaching kids to engage in functional behaviors that they can use and sort of get enjoyment out of. So that's been a really interesting intellectual task to sort of think through what the repercussions are of using this procedure. And we really need a lot more social validity data from RARD research, right? We don't have much data that suggests that it can be done in real classrooms or homes or the real places that kids are. And we really need some information about how participants feel about it and how their caregivers feel about it and how much they're willing to use it. So there's lots of work that can be done in that arena for sure.
Interesting. That's so exciting that you and your team are investigating so many important things for children and all children, but especially children who might have autism or are on the spectrum. Have you always been interested in children with autism?
You know, they were sort of my entry into the field. When I was a child, my parents did foster care. So so I sort of had children living with us who had endured lots of trauma. And we tended to get lots of children who also had secondary disabilities. So I became really interested in sort of childhood development and how the environment impacts how kids develop really early on. But in college, I sort of found this social skills group and I sort of found my people, right? So I'm really interested in kids with autism, but also I think that most of the things that we learn about children with autism can be generalized, right? To children with other disabilities and to children with no disabilities. I think, you know, they're more alike than different. And I think applied behavior analysis is probably applied to children with autism and in ways that we could for sure generalize to other children who don't have disabilities at all.
Yeah, definitely. As an experienced researcher, do you have any tips or advice for people new to the field?
You know, I thought about this for a while. I think that when I was a new researcher, someone told me that I should find a sort of really experienced mentor. And that was helpful to me. But I also think that it's helpful to find people who have similar interests and who are sort of at the same level that you are, or maybe a little bit ahead, but they don't have to be a super well-established researcher. I think my relationships with colleagues who have the same interest as me have really helped me to grow as a researcher in a way that relationships with very well-established people haven't. So it's been really fun to have relationships with people who are doing the same thing I am or doing similar things, but not exactly the same thing, and learning about their perspectives. So I think just keep learning, right? And you need other people to do that. And I also think just in terms of like happiness and well-being, it's really fun to talk with people who are sort of going through the same things that you are. So it sort of helps you both personally and to grow professionally, I think.
Definitely. And you talked about finding your people, nerding out with your tribe. And I think being able to cultivate that and find people that you connect with when you're starting out, but then also mid-career and later career. I think having a research family that you can talk to, that they understand what you're going through, they can be able to help you when you need help, suggest things. I remember I asked this one senior faculty member one time, I was having a bad day and I was leaving the mailbox and I had a rejection. You know, you get rejected from so many different avenues. Students reject you in the classroom sometimes, you know, they give you a bad score on, I mean, not bad score, but teaching perceptions might not be what you hope. Journal articles get rejected. Grants get rejected. I mean, especially as an early career person, you are constantly being rejected. And so I was asking my, not my mentor, but this senior level person, I said, how do you deal with all the rejection? Because I was just so depressed. And he said, I can't remember. It had been so long since he got rejected. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's really hopeful. It's not always
Yes.
going to be like this. You know, the further along you get, the less rejection you'll face because he can't even remember. Or maybe it just doesn't bother him anymore. You know, you get thick skin and broad shoulders, and it's like, okay, whatever, that didn't work out. But I thought, okay, so you're right. It's so good to find your tribe, your people that you can talk to, and it can you can just really be able to have a support system for yourself that way.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, what's your favorite thing about ABA, Dr. Ledford?
Well, I think this sort of ties in with the last thing. I think the community. I think we're sort of all connected by believing in these scientific principles, right? But also, mostly, we're all here because we sort of had this initial desire to help people, right? To use these techniques for sort of like the good of people. And I think that's beautiful, right? It's about science, but it's also about how we can use that science in an applied way to help people. And I think together we can have sort of more positive, more important impacts if we sort of act as a community. And I think that's wonderful, and I love it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, how can people follow you?
My research lab has Instagram, so we're Ledford Lab on Instagram, and my handle on Twitter is Ledford Tweets. So on Ledford Lab, we talk more about early childhood, sort of the research we're doing and how you can help young children. And Ledford Tweets, I'm often nerding out about single case design.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer Ledford. It is such a pleasure to talk to you, and I appreciate your time, and I can't wait to see you at the next conference.
Thanks.
When we can get back to face-to-face or virtual, if that's what it needs to be.
One day we'll see each other in person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.